The Age of European Imperialism, Unit 3. Here we go. So, imperialism, major unit here, Global 10. It's defined as the domination by one country of the political, economic, or cultural life of another country. And what that really means is when a nation, in this case specifically Britain, which is the best example of a mother country, goes to another place and takes over. They do this usually for control, for financial gain, or to spread their way of life to another place. It's usually good for the mother country and bad or difficult for the country that gets taken over. Very often a imperialist nation like Britain will dominate another country to grab their ports, for their resources, and for the right to trade with the people in that region or country. Very often when colonies are established by mother countries like Great Britain, those colonies really are established for the purpose of sending resources to the mother country, and then those people are responsible to purchase the finished materials that the mother country manufactures those resources into. So it's kind of a win-win for the mother country and usually a lose-lose for the imperialized place. So some vocabulary, some terminology here. The word colony means it was established by a mother country. Usually it is exploited, meaning it's taken advantage of by the mother country. During the 19th century or the 1800s, colonial areas could be found in places like India or the Indian subcontinent, the African continent, and Asia, specifically parts of China and even parts of Malaysia. And again, as we said in the previous slide, the idea of the colony is to provide the mother country with cheap sources of labor, ports, resources, and markets. Okay, resources are whatever money-making product could be taken from the area, and a market is simply a place to sell the finished goods. A market represents a group of people, usually who are going to be expected to purchase the manufactured goods from the mother country. Major reasons for imperialism include nationalism, again, pride in your nation. British people in the 1800s took a great source of national pride when they looked at a map and they saw that more than a quarter of the Earth's land surface was taken up by British colonies. Military motives, very often certain areas, certain regions of the world possess strategic value. It's helpful to the nation's military, the Navy, or the Army to have bases in certain areas, so there's military reasons for imperialism. The big one always is the economic piece. Again, markets for manufactured goods and sources of raw materials. And missionary motives, the idea of spreading the word of God, specifically for the British and other European powers, spreading the word of Jesus Christ. Particularly in the earlier phases of imperialism in the 14 and 1500s, that was a major issue, major reason. And during this era of what we kind of referred to as the new imperialism, it was pretty important too, particularly in places like Africa, where there was a belief that the people of the African continent needed to learn about Jesus and to have Jesus in their lives in order to be saved. So in a very real sense, some Europeans really thought they were saving the imperialized people of the world by introducing them to Christ and Christianity. And that idea kind of ties in with this notion, the notion of the white man's burden. For some, it was a justification, meaning it's what made it okay. If you haven't guessed it up to this point, a lot of the historical legacy of imperialism is pretty negative, right? And some Europeans were clued into that idea even when this was happening in the 1800s. But some people, either because they meant it or they wanted to believe it, they believed they were actually helping the people of the imperialized countries, the people of Africa, the people of Asia, the people of India. This is an idea really put forth by people who believe that Europeans had a responsibility to make the lives of the people of the world better. And again, this is an extraordinarily Eurocentric view of the world. It assumes that the European notion of society is superior to that which they found. And if you were to ask a European during the period, there would be no doubt in their mind that, of course, their society was superior. But nobody ever asked the colonized people that question. And unfortunately, the ways of life, the languages, many religions were blotted out by the European way of life. And again, this idea put forth by Europeans, white man's burden, they believed it was for the best. And again, it's an expression of negative attitudes of Europeans toward people of the non-European world. And all this is sort of tied up with this idea of social Darwinism, the idea that some groups have a natural right to dominate others because of a perceived superiority. Kind of taking Charles Darwin's idea of human evolution to a place where it was never intended to go. Society, Darwin's concept, you know, the scientific revolution concept that the species of the world that have survived because they were meant to, because they were more suited to the environment. Social Darwinists apply that logic to the society that we live in, that some societies or some groups or some peoples are superior and more suited to the world, so they win out. And the idea is Europeans are going to bring their way of life to the other parts of the world because it's better, and it will naturally win out because of its superiority. And again, this was a fiction basically created by Eurocentric people or Europeans who believed that their way was simply the best. Major region colonized by the British was India. For a long time, it was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, the Indian subcontinent. The British were in India for 400 years, and it was after the British gave up on it in the late 1940s after World War II, it was seen really as the end of the British Empire. So it's interesting that the British imperialist experience sort of begins and in a sense ends in India, because this was, again, a source of tremendous pride for British nationalists. Initially, the colonization of India was started by a private company, a profit-seeking company called the British East India Company. And again, like any other company, any other private enterprise, the idea is to make money. And really, that became a problem when the people of the subcontinent began to suffer as a result of the company's goal to make money. Really, what winds up happening is, because of the nature of Indian politics amongst the tribes that existed on the subcontinent, even before the British got there, there was a great deal of warfare, Indian on Indian warfare. And very quickly the British came to understand that unless they did something to quell the situation, they were not going to be able to make money. If you're trying to grow tea, and there are tribes constantly fighting each other on the land where you're trying to grow the tea, As the tea grower, you're going to be very interested in ways to create peace so that your product is not disturbed. So eventually what the British begin to do is they begin to sort of militarize the company. The company begins to train and employ soldiers that they train in the British way, using British firearms. These soldiers are called sepoys or sepoys. They're there essentially to protect British economic interests, protect the tea farms and such, so that stability can reign. Now, the British made a lot of changes throughout the Indian subcontinent. First and foremost, they spread the idea of Christianity. They build railroads. They build schools. English becomes the common language of the subcontinent. And again, a lot of these things were in an effort to improve the British hold on the continent. It was easier for the British to control India if they built railroads across it. It was easier for the British to control the way Indians thought if they built the schools and educated the Indians. It became offensive to the Indian people when it became clear to them just how much change the British were about to make to their society. Now, getting back to those sepoys, those are the soldiers employed by the British East India Company. What winds up happening is the sepoys, who are Indian they're trained by the British, but they're Indian people. And they became angered when they discovered that the British were not respecting their religious beliefs. They demanded that the soldiers follow rules that were against those beliefs, in the sense that they were being asked to grease their rifles with the fat of cows. The cow is a holy animal for Hindu believers, and this was deeply, deeply offensive. The British had no regard for that. They didn't care. So as a result, the soldiers rebel against their British masters. And for one of the rare occasions in Indian history here, you see a unification of Hindus and Muslims to together unite against the British, who had taken hold of the subcontinent. Eventually, it was relatively easy for the British to crush the revolt, but it does leave bitter feelings, and it becomes clear even to the British government that the governing of the entire subcontinent of India could not be left to a private company. So really, after this event, after 1858, you're going to see that India becomes what's considered a crown colony, a colony directly administered by the British government, no longer a colony administered by a private money-making enterprise. Now, the British had a lot of impact in India. They changed it in a lot of ways, and in this next section, we're going to take a look at some of those changes. For the first thing here, government. For the first time in hundreds of years, India, really for the first time ever, India was given a single system of law and government. That's because the iron hand of the British basically stamped out the power of local chieftains. And this had the effect, to some degree, of unifying India. Eventually, that unification will work against the British, but for the time being, it was, British railroads, British schools, excuse me, British hospitals that are there to help the British, but eventually some of this stuff is actually going to turn around and bite them, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. More and more there were jobs to be had for Indian people in the army and in the civil service, and eventually educational opportunities. These educational opportunities are going to be a big thing for the Indian people, because eventually they're going to study British law and British government, and they're going to come to understand that the British people consider themselves free. And it's not a very difficult intellectual leap to consider why shouldn't the Indian people enjoy just as much freedom in India as the British do in Britain? So that'll be a source of Indian nationalism down the road. Now, India, the face of India was changed throughout the centuries of British economic control or imperialist control. Um, a lot of canals, roads, bridges, railroads, telegraph lines later. And all of this was ultimately set up in the interest of furthering British economic development of the region. It made it easier to take the cotton, to take the tea, to take the other resources out of India, to build, if those canals, roads, bridges, and railroads were there. It made it more efficient, it made it more profitable for the British. And in the process of doing all these things, local cottage industries, which were Indian, traditional Indian ways of life, basically. Local manufacturers of clothing and processors of food, salt, and things of that nature were basically put out of business by big British industry. And that's a big deal, because ultimately the result of that, or the impact, is that they're going to become dependent upon British imports, which, again, that economic piece is huge. The British are making money by being in India. And for that to stop, for the British to stop making money, would be something that the Indians in their own nationalist movement, led by Gandhi in the 20th century, that would be his primary focus: how to make the British stop making money by being in India. And we'll talk more about that in a couple of months. Unfortunately, the British treated natives, meaning native Indians, like they were inferior. Much was said about the beauty of Hindu society and Indian society, but it was seen as something that's pretty, but not really something that has a lot of substance, unfortunately. The British, by and large, viewed the Indian workforce as a source of inexpensive labor who could be taken advantage of, who could be exploited. And, there's a parallel between what's going on in India during this time and what was going on in Europe, really, at the same time. This was, after all, the same time as the Industrial Revolution. So just as British factory workers in cities like Birmingham were taken advantage of, British entrepreneurs in India are going to take advantage of the native people. Only it's going to be even worse, because the idea here is that these people were somehow inferior, being Hindu believers, being of a different colored skin. There was a great degree of, unfortunately, of racism that was practiced during the British imperialist period. And eventually, this is all going to lead to nationalism, which, again, there's that parallel with the Industrial Revolution again. This is the same thing that's going on in Europe at the time. Downtrodden people who are being taken advantage of by foreign empires are going to desire their own nation state. And by the end of the 19th century, 1885 to be specific, a group of educated middle-class Indians, people who had gone to British schools, Indians who had learned the English language and learned about British law, are going to ask the question, why not us? Why can't we be free? And they're going to form a group called the Indian National Congress. Eventually, there came to be, unfortunately, some religious tension between the two primary religious groups in India, the Hindus and the Muslims. Muslims feared that because the Hindus formed the vast majority of the population on the Indian subcontinent, the Muslims feared that any government that's set up will operate for the benefit of the Hindu majority and the detriment of the Muslim group. So Muslims are going to break away and form their own league in 1906, dedicated to their own state on the Indian subcontinent. Moving forward, what eventually is going to happen after World War II and after the work of Gandhi is you're going to see the rise of two nations, India, specifically India for the Hindu majority, and a nation called Pakistan for the Muslim groups living in the Indian subcontinent. But again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves there, because really for the next 50 years or so, the nationalist movement is going to remain pretty weak, because it's going to really only speak for the educated middle class of Indian person. At the late 19th century, the vast majority of the population in India were still untouchable, were still desperately poor, who mostly illiterate, and they simply didn't identify or even know in a lot of cases about the existence of this sort of Europeanized Indian middle class who were trying to create an Indian state based upon the European model. It'll be years before this idea is eventually recognized. Okay, so European imperialism in Africa, 1870 to 1890 is the approximate time frame that we're dealing with when it comes to other nations taking over and dominating regions inside the continent of Africa. Unlike imperialism in India, when it comes to Africa, you're going to see a number of different European nations taking over places, not just Britain, although Britain is involved. You see nations like Germany, Italy, France, among others, that really do get into the act, so to speak, in the late 1800s, taking over regions in Africa for resources and for markets to sell manufactured goods to. So imperialism in Africa didn't get started until much later than imperialism in other regions. As late as the 1870s, you didn't really see a lot of territory held by European powers. Whatever was held tended to be limited to the coastal trading ports. Those were the regions that the original slave trade operated out of, shipping human cargo out of the continent from those ports. But the interior of Africa remained extremely isolated, and there was a lot of reasons for that. Some of it had to do with the fact that the climate was not particularly healthy for Europeans. They didn't have any natural immunities to the kinds of illnesses that could be acquired inside the continent of Africa. And in addition to that, a lot of the geography of the interior of Africa was extremely difficult to penetrate for European explorers. So for a long time, European interest in Africa tended to remain along the coastal regions. Eventually, when the Europeans do move inward into Africa, they're going to encounter a diversity of cultures, meaning different religious groups, different ethnicities, different belief systems, different languages, and a whole plethora of different political structures, meaning chieftains and other tribal units, things of that nature. But as the 1800s wears on and we begin to approach the 20th century, European powers are going to try to one-up one another to gain territory on the African continent. In some cases, because those areas contain rich natural resources, and in other cases, really because of nationalism. Because if you're France and Britain is taking over parts of Africa, you want to show the world and your people that you can take over regions too. So you see a beginning of this, what's called the scramble for Africa, during the late 1800s, where most of the continent becomes subject to European control. It begins, this quote-unquote scramble for Africa, begins in 1882 when a local revolt threatens the Suez Canal, which is up, northeast Africa, near Egypt. And essentially what happens here is the Suez Canal is a lifeline for ships sailing between Europe and India, because a lot of British trade depended upon that vital waterway. The British are going to take over Egypt very quickly, just to, again, going back to this whole idea that imperialism and money making in these regions depends upon stability. It was important for the British to keep the waterway open at all costs. So when the British take over Egypt to protect the Suez, other European powers are going to want to get involved in Africa too, to essentially show the British that they're strong too. So there you have it. That really this scramble for Africa is really literally European countries bending over backwards to one-up one another so that they can control territory in Africa as well. So inevitably, all of this bending over backwards between the European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, could possibly lead to conflict or war. All right, and there was a tremendous amount of fear amongst the European powers that if they're not careful, a major power war, meaning a European war, could be fought over territories in Africa. So the leaders of Europe have a meeting. The meeting takes place in Berlin, which is in Germany. And at that meeting, essentially what they do is they come to a bunch of agreements about what is fair and not fair in terms of colonizing Africa. Now, that fair and unfair piece is what's fair to the European powers. The leaders had little regard for the people who lived in Africa, meaning native Africans were not invited to the meeting. Their tribal leaderships were not included in any of the discussions. And ultimately, what you have here is a kind of what we call an arbitrary division of Africa, meaning a map of Africa was spread out at the meeting, and the European powers basically picked and choose who gets what. And unfortunately for the Africans, they were not included in this discussion, and what wound up happening was really a lot of people's tribal groups that really didn't want to be put together into the same colony, got put together into the same colony. And in addition to that, other groups that had traditionally lived amongst one another, tribal regions that were part of the same unit, were actually divided. And again, this is because of the arbitrary nature of the way the Europeans divided up Africa. They didn't consult the peoples of the continent, so demographic differences between the groups, meaning population groups, who lived where, were not considered, and some people were broken apart, other people were lumped together who had traditionally fought, and ultimately what this leads to is a major, major mess on the African continent, particularly during the 20th century when these colonies will declare independence from their European masters. It's going to lead to a lot of challenges for nationalism in Africa. Now, one major conflict that occurred during this period, or towards the end of this period, was what happened in South Africa between the British and between certain Dutch descendants and tribal peoples. So we'll take a look at some of this right now. The southern part of Africa had been dominated by the Zulu tribe. In the early 1800s, Shaka Zulu was a tribal leader who had actually organized his people into a coherent fighting force to resist European intrusion, which for a time works, but again, ultimately what occurs here is the British are going to defeat the Zulu and push them north from where their original dominant region was. Now, 100 years before the late 1800s, certain Dutch people called Boers had settled in southern Africa. And what they did was they steadily moved northward, almost in the path of the Zulu. Dutch herders and ivory hunters began to move north and establish communities. And when they did that, they encountered African groups like the Zulu and frequently fought with them. Okay. Now, at the same, a little bit after that, in the mid-1800s or so, the British acquired South Africa, or what was called Cape Colony, from the Dutch. And that means the southernmost tip of the African continent came into British control. And inevitably what follows that is conflict between the Dutch descendants of the original colonizers and the new British imperialists. These Dutch were settled mainly in the north of Cape Colony, and again, because the British are looking to expand, that's going to lead to some direct conflict between these two groups who are essentially Europeans fighting over African land. So what happened in the late 1800s was that Britain decided to annex or simply take over those northern Boer communities, those communities settled by the Dutch to the north of Cape Colony. And that's not going to go over too well with the Dutch or the Boers. They're going to resist, they're going to fight a war, And this is a really bloody war. Sometimes historians refer to the Boer War sort of as the British Vietnam, because it was a similar conflict in the sense that um, they were fighting over a piece of land that few people in Britain understood even where it was. And if they did understand where it was, many people didn't understand why they were actually fighting and dying to protect this particular piece of land. So this was a bitter struggle that lasted from 1899 to 1902. And eventually the British do win. They vanquish the Boers and they take over the northern republics, but not before a lot of bloodshed. And really, this has a big impact on the later history of South Africa, or the Union of South Africa, which is proclaimed after this conflict, because there's so many Dutch descendants that live in this particular colony of the British Empire. Um, there's going to be a lot of distrust and hatred between the original Boers and the new British imperialists. And that's really going to be because the Boers thought they had gotten a raw deal, that it was their territory and the British came and took it from them. And now the country that's basically created as a result of it, you're going to see an uneasy mixture between British leaders and Dutch leaders who ultimately are not going to be able to get along very well with each other. Now, just like there was tremendous impact of imperialism in India, there's going to be a lot of impact of imperialism on Africa too. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the impacts are very similar to what we discussed with the Indian experience. So, major difference here though is that unlike India, where it was only the British who were imperializing, in Africa you're going to see a number of different European countries place their imprint on their respective colonies. So, and through this discussion, it's really pretty clear that a lot of the impact of imperialism tends to be negative. Cultures are destroyed, things like that. But it's important sometimes to remember too that there was some good that came out of the efforts of the Europeans in these regions. One was medicine. You see an improvement overall in nutrition and lifespan of Africans who were in contact with the Europeans. So you're going to see population growth in Africa, which can be good or bad, but for the individual African, the improved nutrition and things like that tended to help. You're going to see the rise of modern transportation and communication systems like railroads, steamships, and telegraphs. You're going to see more agricultural output because modern techniques are introduced. And again, although this has some kind of a positive impact on the African peoples, the Europeans do it because it helps them make money. Remember, the more railway track you place across the continent, the more ability you have to get those resources from the interior of the continent to the ports and then ultimately to Europe for trade. So again, although there was some good that came out of it, in the end it's important to remember that the Europeans did this because it helped their economic goals. And just like in India as well, you see some groups of people in Africa who gain or receive improved educations and more economic opportunity. And eventually it's going to be these groups, the people who were educated in the European way, eventually who are going to begin to demand independence for their colonies. And again, independence and nationalism in Africa is dealing with that additional challenge because of those artificially imposed European boundaries that the way the colonies were created. So even after independence is gained, as a result of those improved educations and things like that, Africa is going to struggle to maintain nations within, because there's so many sort of contradictory forces that were built in. And when I say contradictory forces, I mean like tribal groups, linguistic groups, religious groups that didn't get along, that were pushed into the same colonies. So in the 20th century, you're going to see a great deal of civil war in Africa. Okay, and that's going to be a major topic later in the year that we discuss. And here it is, negative impact, right? The erosion of traditional African values. You're going to see many African languages in particular are going to cease to exist because of the impulse of the Europeans to teach their own language. They're going to be treated as inferiors, the people of Africa. They're going to be utilized for their labor. They're going to be paid very little. Again, there's a parallel here to what was going on inside of Europe during the industrial era. And there it is. That last bullet point there is probably the biggest important thing to remember here, that in the sense that Europeans divided up Africa, ignoring tribal, ethnic, and cultural boundaries. Such artificial boundaries have led to long-term conflict, both inside and between African countries. That's what leads to the civil wars in the 20th century, because people who didn't want to be put together were put together. Other people who wanted to stay together were pulled apart because the Europeans never bothered to talk to the African groups that they were dominating, and ultimately made some mistakes in the organization of their colonies. So now we are shifting our focus eastward. Okay, so the important thing to remember about this Age of European Imperialism unit is that it is a worldwide phenomenon. European powers were taking over or trying to dominate in some fashion places throughout the world. That includes India, Africa, Japan, and eventually we'll even talk about China. Now, the interesting thing about Japan and the experience with imperialism is that the Japanese, although Western powers, and in this case including the United States, are going to attempt to take over or dominate the economies of these regions, the Japanese are going to take a unique strategy to disallow that from happening. And it's really quite fascinating how the Japanese sort of fight off the Western menace here. So we'll take a look at that now. This period of time, really thinking about the 1870s or so to the early 1900s, sometimes they say 1905 is the end of what's called the Meiji Restoration, you're going to see a rapid period of modernization and industrialization occur in Japan. The Japanese are going to, by themselves in a lot of senses, change their government, economy, and social lives to be more reflective of those of Europe. And eventually, because Japan is a small island lacking in resources, the Japanese themselves are actually going to go out and build empire, similar to the way the British, the French, the Germans were in the process of doing. The interesting thing about the Meiji period in Japan is that, unlike what happened in India, unlike what happened in Africa, and unlike what's eventually going to happen in China as well, the Japanese are going to make a conscious effort as a society to learn from the Western peoples. And when I say the Western peoples, I mean the United States, I mean Britain, I mean, I mean Germany, France. They're going to make a conscious effort to learn the ways of the foreigner, and then they're going to utilize those ways to preserve their own independence. So we'll take a look at some of that right now. Originally, contact between Japan and the outside world occurred in 1853, really 1853 to 54. The United States, as a matter of fact, is going to send an expedition to Tokyo, which is going to end a 200-year, sort of a self-imposed 200-year period of isolation from the Tokugawa shoguns. This is a family that had dominated Japan for hundreds of years, and had essentially outlawed travel outside the country and had outlawed visitation into the country from foreigners for fear of what foreign society would bring. But what happened here was Commodore Perry, there he is, leads a squadron of American warships into Edo Bay, which is outside Tokyo. And these ships arrive with their guns blazing and their crew on board looking very, very menacing. And Commodore Perry comes out of the ship and speaks with the officials gathered on the Japanese dock. And he presents a letter from the American president, President Millard Fillmore, basically asking the Japanese leaders permission to use Edo Bay and some other parts of Japan as coaling stations for their ships. Remember, in the 1800s, a lot of the naval powers of the world were in the process of sort of shifting to steam power in their ships, and because coal is extremely heavy, you need stations located throughout strategic parts of the world. And as it turns out, Japan was extremely strategic for American trading interests in the Pacific. To have a coaling station in Japan would allow the American merchant marine and naval power to troll the Pacific, with constant sources of fuel. So the American president is, again, quote unquote, asking permission of the Japanese officials to have a trading station, but the officials could see very plainly that if the Americans were turned away, America was quite prepared to take what they want using force, and that was the reason why a commodore, a naval commander, was sent to Japan with the guns blazing to really sort of drive the point home that this really wasn't a request, it was more of a demand made with a smiling face, so to speak. And the Japanese got the message. They did open up the ports to trade, and very quickly now you're going to see a conscious effort made by the leadership of Japan after it changes to sort of modernize along Western lines so that they can't be dominated in the fashion that India and China and Africa were being at the same time. So there it is. This is basically what I just talked about in the previous slide. Perry presents the letter from the U.S. president, open up its ports. Also, in addition to the coaling stations, there was some permission being asked to use ports for trade, sell American manufactured goods to the Japanese market. Again, but Japan would really serve as an ideal coaling station for the ships. And the Japanese were extremely impressed by the American fleet that had sailed into its bay. And they quickly signed a treaty which ends more than 200 years of Tokugawa or Japanese isolation from the rest of the world. And in this, they're going to really do a complete 180. They're going to go from being a very isolated country to a very sort of extroverted country, where they're going to invite American experts, British experts, German experts, and everything from the military to education to their country. And they're actually going to send out their own students into the other, send people to America, send people to Germany and Britain to learn the ways of those powers and then bring those ways home to Japan. So Japan is really going to embark upon a period where they're trying to learn from their perceived adversaries so that those adversaries can't take over. And it's really 1867 where this gets going in earnest. You're going to see a rebellion that takes the Tokugawa powers out of the picture. You see, the Tokugawa family was just a powerful family that had governed over Japan in a sort of medieval fashion for 200 years. But this rebellion is going to put the rightful emperor of Japan, Emperor Meiji in this case, as the leader, or at least a sort of figurehead leader that other political believers in westernization are going to use as their sort of rallying point. So in 1868, you see Emperor Meiji is going to be reestablished as the leader of Japan. He's going to have a group of advisors who advise him on the proper ways to modernize and industrialize. And this emperor and this group, this government, really from 1868, and sometimes it's 1905, sometimes they say 1912, they call the period the Meiji Restoration because it's the restoration of the emperor to the throne as the rightful leader of Japan. And again, it's not that he's going to act as an absolute monarch here. He is going to have groups of advisors that he works with, but their ultimate goal is going to be to learn from the West and try to sort of beat the West at their own game, which by 1905 they're going to become quite good at. And here it is, you see, borrowing from the West. They want to strengthen Japan by sending officials overseas to learn about government, economics, technology, and customs. They're going to allow foreign exports and experts into Japan to teach them. Here you see a picture. It's a little hard to make out, I see that. But what you have is traditional-looking Japanese women playing a European harpsichord, which, again, that's sort of demonstrates the blending here. The Japanese are going to try to accept everything that's good from the West while retaining what makes them unique, and in a sense, what makes them Japanese. This is a unique approach to the challenge of imperialism faced by parts of the non-European world in the 1800s. As it turns out, the Japanese very quickly are going to embark on this program and very successfully arrive at a place by the beginning of the 20th century where they can, in fact, meet the Western challenge head on. So this is sort of an unprecedented response to the Western challenge of imperialism that the Japanese successfully do. You're going to see a lot of economic development along Western lines. You're going to see an industrial system that is established, meaning factories. And again, it's sort of interesting the way the Japanese government goes from this medieval period where nobles control the land. Essentially, what the government does is it says they make a series of laws or legislation that takes the land away from the nobles, but gives the noble families incentives and an easy path to purchase factories. So what you have here is a sort of traditional Japanese social hierarchy, which had always been based on land ownership and control, simply shifting to factory ownership and control. And that's a pretty big deal because it puts Japan in a position to compete with the Western world economically in a way that other Asian powers at the time simply didn't do. And with that, you're going to see the development of modern banking systems and protocols. That's a big deal. You know, lending. The most important function of a bank is to lend money, particularly lend money to start businesses or enterprises. So a well-developed banking system is central to any industrial economy, and the Japanese are going to develop that. You'll see systems of postal, post office system established throughout Japan. Again, it doesn't really help to build a factory and develop a product unless you could actually ship that product to the home market, which is inside of Japan, which the postal system is going to help. You see railroads, improved ports, all of these things. Really what's happening here is Japan is gearing itself up to directly compete with the West. You see population growth, urbanization, people moving from the countryside to the cities. And really by 1900, Japan, 1890 to 1900, Japan is every bit as much an industrial power as nations like Britain, Germany, and even in some senses the United States. Now, the other major Asian country that was affected by imperialism was China. And it's sort of interesting what happens in China when you compare it to the impact of imperialism in other places like India, Africa, and Japan. Basically, the way it starts, imperialism affects China in a very similar way to the way it affects Africa. And then eventually, the Chinese are going to try to institute policies to sort of mirror what the Japanese did, only with a much lower degree of success, I think. So we'll take a look at some of that now. Now, again, this is all happening simultaneously. That's something important to remember. It's not just that first the Europeans imperialized India, then they imperialized Africa, then they went to Japan. That happens to be the order that we're discussing it, but it's important to remember that all of these things were sort of happening simultaneously. Now, imperialism had affected the Chinese for hundreds of years. But for a long time, in the 1600s and the early 1700s, the Chinese were in a position to simply turn the European offers for trade away. This is due to a sense of ethnocentrism in China that reigned supreme during the Qing dynasty. Belief that foreigners were barbarians and there was nothing that the European world could offer to China that could enrich or help China, so they simply turned trade offers from the Europeans away. And unlike Japan, China is going to be refusing to adopt Western ways, at least at first. Okay, but the result of that, really, by the 1800s, the economic, political, and military strength of European imperialist nations are going to sort of supersede that of China. So China starts out ahead of the Europeans in the 1600s, but because of a lack of an ability or a willingness to modernize, eventually the European powers are going to be able to challenge China and basically dominate China in a similar fashion, not the same way they dominated India or Africa, but dominate China in a similar fashion. Um, and again, you can, from the last unit, we talked a little bit about the decline of the Ottoman Empire because of their failures to modernize. Well, that's a similarity here too in China. There was a failure to modernize, a failure to keep pace with modern technology. And as a result, the Chinese dynasts, the Qing or Manchu rulers, are going to pay the price, pay the ultimate price, as a matter of fact, for that. Now, imperialism in China, again, imperialism anywhere is really usually about making money, selling goods to a market, right? And one thing that the British found that they could sell to the Chinese market, this was a captive market here, was opium. Opium is a narcotic that really spawns from poppies, which grow in India. And the British already controlled India, so one thing that seemed logical to British merchants was to grow the opium and then sell it to this tremendous Chinese market. Remember, China then and now is the most populous country in the world. Billions of people who live there. So basically the opportunity to sell to those people really was too much for the British to resist. So what the British began doing was they began sort of smuggling and selling this drug to the Chinese people throughout the really 17 and 18, early part of the 1800s. And really, like any government, the Chinese government recognized the harmful effects of this drug on their population. So they passed laws, this is the Chinese government, that makes the drug illegal. Now, the British, who were profiting handsomely from the sale of opium to the Chinese, didn't really care that the Chinese government had outlawed this drug that had become so profitable to them. So in 1839, the British are going to go to war with the Chinese, and eventually it's a series of wars. There's 3 opium wars that are fought between the 1830s and the 1850s. And these wars are going to be called the Opium Wars, and it's really over the right of the British to sell this drug to the Chinese people. And unfortunately for the Chinese, because of the advancement of the British military, the British were able to easily win all of these conflicts, which is going to sort of force the Chinese to accept the British terms, which are going to be very, very harsh. And the terms, really, that the Chinese are forced to accept are best sort of demonstrated by this treaty, the Treaty of Nanjing. And Nanjing's a city in China, I mean, where the treaty was signed. But this is really just one of a series of what are called unequal treaties that European powers basically dictated to the Chinese, because the Chinese military was basically helpless in the face of British and German and French and Belgian strength. The Chinese had to accept these sort of harsh terms. So in the case of the Treaty of Nanjing, this is the treaty that sort of wraps up the opium conflicts here, and China had to pay for Britain's war costs, open up ports to British trade, and that includes British trade of opium, drugs. And Britain outright annexed the island of Hong Kong, which means Britain took it over politically. Now, an important thing to remember here, talking about the Treaty of Nanjing, is the difference between the way imperialism played out economically and politically in China with how it did in India and Africa. In India and Africa, you see the outright colonization of territory, where like the British take chunks of India and chunks of Africa and make them colonies. In China, this wasn't really possible because the Chinese, although they were backward technologically, they were still unified as a country with a common political system, and they had been for hundreds of years. So in that sense, China was stronger than the groups of people that the Europeans encountered in places like India and Africa. So instead of outright colonization of these places, you're going to see the division of China into these economic spheres of influence, and we'll talk a bit about that next. Again, you're not going to see outright takeover of territory, except for limited places like Hong Kong and things like that. But you are going to see this sort of new concept, which is like the economic imperialism in a region, referred to as spheres of influence. And there it is. There's a picture of China at the height of the sphere of influence period here. And a sphere of influence is defined as an area in which an outside power claims exclusive trade privileges. And what that means is, if you look down at the key, you have nations like France, Britain, Germany, Japan, and Russia, who all claim spheres of territory on or in the Chinese nation. And that doesn't mean that France, Britain, Germany, Japan, and Russia outright politically control those regions. These are not colonies. These are simply places where only the respective nations that control those financial regions can trade. So in other words, if you look up in the north, you see a Russian sphere of influence shown in the red. In that region, only the Russians can sell their goods. So essentially, the Russians have a monopoly of trade over the people who live in that particular region. If you look a little bit to the south, you see a purple sphere of influence. That's the sphere controlled by the Japanese. In that particular region, only the Japanese can sell goods. So people living in that region cannot buy goods from the British or the French or anybody else for that matter. Only the Japanese. So again, what the spheres of influence provide for the dominating or imperialist powers is an economic or a trading monopoly inside of given regions. And then there were some other things too that went along with this, and then we'll talk about that now. Now, the United States, if you notice here, you see the map, where's my slice, right? Sort of taking over these spheres of influence, places like Russia, Germany, Britain, France, Japan. The U.S. is not a part of this. And there was a couple of reasons for that. It's nothing high and mighty either. It's not that the United States was too good to establish spheres of influence. It was simply that we came to the imperialism party a little bit late. And all the good regions, all the good markets were already sort of scarfed up by the other powers. So Secretary of State John Hay is going to make a proposal here. He's going to propose something called the open door policy, which really is a proposal to do away with these spheres of influence. And he makes a compelling case. Basically, he says, you know, there's a huge market here in China. There's lots of people to buy goods. Why should any nation limit itself to selling only to one part of China? Why not openly compete with one another to try to get as much trade as we can? So the open door policy is a kind of an incentive-based system. The idea is to try to garner as much of the Chinese market as possible. So it keeps China open to trade with all nations. And really, eventually, all the outside powers do agree to this because, again, there's you know, why limit yourself to just one place in China? Why not try to get the whole pie, so to speak? And again, the Chinese, although America sort of makes an attempt here to present this as something that's good for the Chinese understand that this is simply just another outside power trying to sell goods to the Chinese people. So although the Chinese don't agree to this and they resent this to some degree, again, similar to Africa, they are not really consulted, and the outside powers do what they want to do, and they put this into effect. Now, we've said a lot here about the Chinese and how they have reacted to imperialism. It's been pretty negative. The Europeans and the Americans and even the Japanese essentially have been able to dictate terms to the Chinese because of their advanced militaries and the failure of the Chinese militaries to keep pace. So eventually what's going to happen here is you're going to see at first clashes between the Chinese themselves over how to deal with the onslaught of the outside powers. And then you're going to see sort of clashes between the Chinese and the European and American and Japanese powers themselves. And we'll take a look at some of those right now. In the 1850s, there's a massive rebellion that occurs throughout China. It's called the Taiping Rebellion, and millions of people lose their lives as a result. And really, what this is a Chinese civil war, essentially. This is a rebellion against the Qing dynasty, otherwise known as the Manchu dynasty. It's led by a peasant leader. His name Hong Xiquan. And basically, he considered himself a prophet of Christ in a lot of senses. In some readings, he maybe even considered himself another incarnation of Jesus Christ. But really, this was a rebellion against the strict hierarchy in Chinese society. Again, because land ownership was so important. And allowed for so much power. He endorsed ideas like equality and land division, meaning lands controlled by wealthy families in China would be given to the people. And again, because this was a peasant revolt, the majority of the people in China were peasants. This has a major impact on the Chinese in terms of death. A lot of people die as a result of this, and it weakens China tremendously. And it weakens China at a time where they're already dealing with outside challenges from the Western powers and Japan. So it's really going to be a result of the Taiping Rebellion that Russia is going to establish its sphere of influence to the north of China, because that region was so depopulated as a result of this conflict. A little bit later, you're going to see something called the Boxer Rebellion. And this is a direct rebellion against the European and Western or outside powers that were establishing the spheres of influence in China. This was a group, the Boxers, otherwise known as the Society of Harmonious Fists. They're going to attack foreign communities. These are trading communities inside the spheres of influence that the Boxers deem as the problem, really deem, everything that's wrong with China is because of these communities. So they're going to attack them. And the outside world forms a united front against these Boxers. And you're going to see a massive international army composed of British troops, Japanese troops, German troops. And they're actually going to be led by the Germans in crushing this uprising. And really very similar to the way very similar to the way the Opium Wars ended. You're going to see more unequal treaties. The Chinese government is going to be forced to grant more concessions or give away more of the government's power to the foreign nations. And it's really going to be after this, you're going to see the rise of the modern nationalist reform movement. So basically, after this whole experience throughout the second half of the 1800s of China being dominated economically, militarily, politically by the outside powers, now you're going to see a call amongst some for China to modernize in the fashion that Japan had 50 years earlier. And eventually that nationalism that really develops in China sort of blossoms in in the early part of the 1900s. Sun Yat-sen, or Sun Yat-sen, is going to lead a movement to replace the Qing dynasty. And eventually, and again, we're going fast through this, but eventually he's going to be relatively successful, at least successful in the sense that he topples the centuries-old Qing dynasty. And really, he had a three-part program. One was to end foreign domination. Another was to form a representative or democratically fashioned government. And three, to create some sort of economic security for the people, so that the people of China are no longer, subject to the spheres of influence and the open door policy and things like that. So there's going to be a revolution which succeeds in 1911. You see the end of again, thousands of years worth of Chinese dynastic monarchy comes to an end forever in 1911. And you will see Sun Yat-sen named the president of the Chinese Republic. And that brings really, and again, now China, after this, is going to embark upon really 30 years of civil war before the communist regime is instituted, and then you're going to see more conflict after that. But this is really the end of an era for the Chinese in the undoing of the dynastic system which had lasted for so long. And that also brings our discussion of the imperialist period to an end here. Not that imperialism ends after 1911, because it doesn't, it goes on, but this unit comes to an end here, and we'll see imperialism continue to have an effect in the subsequent units. When we, next thing we talk about will be the causes of World War I, and you'll see that imperialism was a major cause of that, and so on and so forth. So what we've discussed in this unit is British imperial, really the definition of imperialism, the impact of British imperialism in India, the impact of European imperialism throughout Africa, sort of the Japanese unique approach to combating the imperialist menace in their country, referred to as the Meiji Restoration, and then, the mixed bag of results from imperialism in China. Initially, again, China suffers at the hands of the imperialists, but then eventually they do establish a modern nation state under Sun Yat-sen. And again, the end of that dynastic system. So, until next time, I'll see you in Global.